Hey everyone, my name is Chloe Baptiste, and welcome to another session of our Becoming series, where we come together to learn about careers in energy efficiency. We are grateful to the two sponsors who make this series possible, Natural Resources Canada and Electricity Human Resources Canada. Both sponsors are key in growing the Canadian energy efficiency workforce, and we could not do this without them. The Becoming series is where we meet leaders in the sector and hear their story of how they got started, what skills are important for their role, and advice they have for people looking to follow in their footsteps. I also want to start this event with a land acknowledgement. I live and work in Montreal, Quebec. Montreal is located on unceded Indigenous lands, the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters of Tiohtià:ke, otherwise called Montreal. I invite you to learn about the land you are on and deepen your understanding of the history of the nations of whose land you live on. So today's speaker is Maka. She is a Wetland Restoration Specialist. She studied a Bachelor of Science with cooperative education at St. Mary's University. Her work helps to inform decisions on the implementation of nature-based solutions. It addresses the knowledge gap on coastal protection studies and nature-based adaptation to climate change. With that being said, invite Maka to share about her role.
Thank you, Chloe. Hi, everyone. My name is Maka. As Chloe already mentioned, she's given quite the introduction, so I won't spend too much time on that. Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you for coming. Today, I will be sharing a little bit about my career path and what my current journey looks like and my way to being an environmental consultant. And at the end, we will have questions, so there'll be time to discuss. And if you have any questions, we can talk about that. So I currently work as a wetland restoration specialist for a consulting company called CB Wetlands, an environmental specialist. And basically they focus on wetland monitoring and also assessing the quality of those wetlands that we have out here on the Atlantic coast and how we can have adaptation strategies that are leaning towards the use of nature-based solutions. So in this presentation, I am going to give you just a brief introduction on what nature-based solutions are, just to lay the background and explain how it leads into my work on coastal protection. And then we'll discuss about my role. We'll get to know what my day looks like and what my work is all about. I'll also share a little bit about my background and how I ended up in this field. And then we'll leave you with some tips to go with. So according to the UCN, nature-based solutions are actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. So that's the definition that the IUCN came up with. But when we're looking at nature-based solutions, we're looking at combining protection and then also looking at issue specific. So what exactly are we focusing on? What is the problem that we are focusing on? And what infrastructure do we have, or what infrastructure can we use for us to address that issue? And how can we manage that? And also perhaps we could look at restoration, certain situations where there is degradation of the environment. What can we do to restore that environment or that type of ecosystem? And all of that is also due to the societal challenges that we face, but we need to have a good balance between the human well-being and the biodiversity benefits. So when we combine all those things, we have human well-being and biodiversity benefits being met, and we can ensure that the environment is healthy, but also that humans are benefiting from it without abusing the environment. So they are basically approaches that are tackling climate change, that harness nature to do the job it's meant to do, which is basically to preserve lives. And they can be as simple as allowing forests to regrow, restoring coastal wetlands, or maybe switching to regenerative agricultural practices so that we can attain a more sustainable future or make sure that our ecosystems are at equilibrium. So in the next slide, I will give you examples of nature-based solutions. So many of you may or may not have come across these already. The most common one that we have is like a typical green wall. These are usually found in buildings, and they'll have plants that are also hosting habitat for small, tiny little creatures, but also the purpose of these is not only to be aesthetically pleasing, but also to allow for a reduced energy cost in a building, but also allowing for the air in that building to be cooler and cleaner and fresher because there is vegetation present. And then when we look at other types of nature-based solutions, there are bioswales, which allow when rain comes in or any rain event comes in, you often see that if there is a paved surface, percolation doesn't occur. So what happens is that surface runoff tends to flow onto the streets, and that will increase the percentage of flooding that could occur. However, when we have vegetation present, the raindrops or the water that comes in from a storm event tends to seep into the ground. And so vegetation provides that surface area that's required for that water to enter into the soil and enter below ground into the water table. So we have other options such as green roofs. Again, those also help to reduce energy, increase efficiency in a building by allowing the building to be cooler, but also while providing clean air and habitat for tiny creatures and other kinds of creatures that use or are hosted by these green roofs. Now, this leads me to coastal protection and how this is structured in our province. So there are many ways in which we can look at coastal protection and restoration. So the first one is no response. And this means that there's literally nothing that we're going to do about it. We're just going to have our infrastructure by the ocean, and we're going to ignore that there is the risk of sea level rise. But usually what happens is that we tend to have a protection strategy whereby we put up a seawall, we could have a riprap revetment, we could have a dike. It just depends on the site, the wave energy at that site, the design that's required or modified based on the storm events and the type of infrastructure. So that would fall under protection. And usually we have hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure, or like gray infrastructure and green infrastructure, depending on the type of environment that we're in, but also thinking about the wave energy that's experienced at whatever site that is. And then we also have accommodation. Now, this is mostly working with whatever infrastructure we have or whatever accommodation we have. So we'll have, maybe there's a house along the coastline, and then you want to put it on a higher platform so that when the incoming waves reach the coast, they don't actually flood that housing. And it's similarly to advance. You could also just decide that, you know what, we could advance this infrastructure and allow it to be protected in this manner. Another way to do it is to retreat, which is to literally move back the property further away so that by the time the waves reach the surface, they don't actually affect the type of a structure or the building that's present. And then this brings me to ecosystem-based adaptation, which is mostly what my work is focused on as a wetland restoration specialist. So what happens is oftentimes, especially in Atlantic Canada, we have coastal wetlands, or what we also refer to as salt marshes. And these are known to be good because they are highly diverse ecosystems, but they also allow for wave energy dissipation and flood control. They can adapt in the face of sea level rise because they keep pace with sea level rise as sedimentation occurs. So in this case, we're looking at using nature as a form of engineering to help to protect the coast. And this happens in different parts of the world, but it is very site specific. So if the area is cold, or if the region is cold, or if the wave energy is different, like in the Bay of Fundy, we have the highest tides in the world. So that would look differently from maybe the UK or another salt marsh in the UK. Now, as we continue to see ecosystem-based adaptation we need to first really truly understand what the site looks like. And that's where my work comes in. So for my position, the key responsibilities would be wetland and environmental monitoring. So this really involves me collecting data and analyzing ecological data. So this can go from invertebrate data, it can go from soil samples or sediment cores to analyze how much carbon is there, and then carrying out some surveys depending on the study site. So usually what happens is if we have a contract with a company, they decide what they want us to do. So it can be a 4-year monitoring plan, and we will design a 4-year monitoring plan. And maybe the first year would be getting a lay of the land or trying to understand how the site changes with also the tides and how maybe erosion at that site is, what the habitat at that site looks like. So that would happen maybe in the first year. And then in the second year, we go out on the field and we also monitor any changes. Has the site changed in the past year that we haven't been on the site? What are some of the potential risks that could take place? Should there be construction of something or destruction of something? And so basically, a heavy part of my role involves collecting those hydrology samples or hydrology data, soil samples and sediment samples, carrying out vegetation surveys. So sometimes species at a site are an indicator of the site is basically the state of the site. So the health of that ecosystem is reflected whether there are halophytes, which are salt-loving plants or not, and whether there are whether there is some other type of vegetation or not. And we also carry out geospatial surveys. There are people on our team that are trained to fly drones and to analyze that drone imagery to see how the site has changed over time. And then also develop and implement nature-based shoreline management designs. So this is a big part because it's the use of nature-based solutions. So after we've collected that data, we want to see how we can develop a strategy in which we can implement nature-based solutions. So this is just an instrument that I would have deployed to measure the wave energy at a site. And one of them is actually a study site. So sometimes we have a reference site, which is a site that's perfectly healthy, and we use that data to compare to a site that is proximal to that area but not perfectly healthy, so that we can see what changes are occurring and how that site can reach its as close to its natural original state as possible. And when it comes to restoration, usually when we say we're restoring something, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will go back to the exact state that it was in, but we're trying to get it to as close to that healthy state as it was, but also taking into account that it won't exactly return to what it originally was before human interference. Some other parts of my skills that are required for this kind of work, you basically need to have qualitative and quantitative analysis skills. So what happens is you're going to go out on the field and you should be able to do the tedious work like counting stems by hand, and sometimes like measuring plant heights, identifying the plants, and sometimes you have to look through keys and follow a key or follow a guide. Sometimes it involves you just simply taking a photo and uploading it to iNaturalist or somewhere where you can get an immediate response. But also, even after going out there, you need to be able to put that data into graphs or Excel or whatever software. So some people use RStudio, some people use MATLAB. Whatever software can statistically show or represent how the site is changing is often a way to present our data, and simple graphs can also be used. A big part is also research and collaboration, because we do work with St. Mary's University students, but we also work with different stakeholders. So different project partners will hop onto a project and they will each have different requirements or different needs that should be met. So you need to be able to collaborate with different teams, but also ensure that you're able to communicate clearly what your role is, but also communicate what your data finds have been. Because when you go out there on the field, only you've been out there and people are actually relying on the data that you've collected. And sometimes it's also just observational data. So taking photos and like observing the movement or the flow of the water can be a really good way of understanding how the site is changing or will change in the next few months or next few years. And in these photos, I have a photo frame which I actually designed to measure vegetation height. instead of counting these stems, we take photos and then we use that to calculate the ratio of how much vegetation is present versus what's not on the board. And then next to it is actually one of the instruments that I did show you earlier, which is this one right here. This instrument measures the wave energy. It measures also the temperature, the pressure, and whatever else you require at the site. You can get those parameters and then analyze that data through a software so that you can present it to your project partners. So in terms of what a day in my life looks like, I do believe in working hard and doing your best, but I also believe in working smart. Sometimes there's no point in spending hours and hours on a task whereby you could simplify that task or ask a coworker to guide you, or you could use a software and then you use half the time to actually do whatever you need to do. So I will start off with what my day looks like when I am on the field. One of the things that I really love about my position is that I actually don't have to work in the office every single day. And I say this because I don't actually enjoy office work. And that's one of the reasons why I chose this career path. I knew that I wanted to have a balance of a little bit of office work and then a little bit of outdoors, because I would just literally can't do the whole office thing for hours. And I commend all my friends and colleagues that are in the office 9 to 5 every day, but I know it's not for me. So a typical day for me on the field would be an early start. It involves preparation prior. So the day before, or maybe weeks before, depending on how long the deployment is, would involve us planning what we're going to do, where we're going to do it, how many instruments or what equipment we need, and how many people we need. So maybe we're going on the field the next day. We'll get up early and usually we drive out to the site. So most of our sites are maybe like an hour away or 40 minutes, sometimes 5 hours. It just depends on how long the deployment is going to be. So when we drive out, we would have checked the tide schedule, so we know that it's low tide at this hour and high tide at this hour. And this is very important because you need to understand the safety that lies behind knowing when the tide will come in. Otherwise, there is actually a risk of you drowning. So when you know the tide schedules, then you know when you're going to go out. So usually if I'm doing vegetation surveys at a place, I have the locations on my phone or on a GPS handheld receiver, and we go to each spot and we count the vegetation, or we identify what vegetation is at that location. But if we're doing flights, I'm deploying ground control points, which are basically flat tiles that help whoever's going to assess the drone imagery to control it or validate that data. And then if I'm deploying wave instruments or water level loggers to understand how much water is present at a site, it could be a river, then I need to find a good location. Maybe I'll decide that I want to put out a logger in a channel. So I have that exact location. I'll measure the coordinates and then I'll deploy it maybe on a stake or somewhere, and I'll leave it out for another 4 to 6 weeks or even months, depending on how long that instrument can last outside. So that's a typical day on the field. And usually like we pack snacks and we eat on the go. It can be a fast day or slow day, depending on what you're doing. So if it's a fast day, sometimes you don't even have that much time to actually like sit down and have a proper lunch. You just, as you walk and you eat. And then on other days, we actually do have moments where we just sit down, feel the breeze on our faces, and just watch the water and just relax outside, which is the beauty of working outside and in nature. So usually what happens is my field season would run from May right up till September or mid-fall. So a typical day outside field season is definitely very much different. Of course, I don't wake up at 7, but I'll like probably get ready for work to start at 9. So it could be a 9 to 5 or an 8 to 4, depending on what my day looks like. And usually I'll have a check-in meeting with my manager and a set of tasks that are assigned for that week. And I would probably be analyzing data. So I work a lot with hydro data, which is basically data collected from the rivers and just trying to understand that water level and like how that data has changed over time. So I'll clean up the data set, put it through a script or work with it in Excel, produce figures and graphs that are required for reports and publications. And those reports are often for our stakeholders or any company that would have hired us to work on a certain contract. So that is actually it seems like it's a small task, but it takes a bit of time for you to actually look through the data, analyze it. And so that can also be a very high computer focused type of task. So I'll find myself at my desk for 3 hours straight or 2 hours, and I have to remind myself to take breaks. But then the beauty is that I know that when the summer comes, I'll be outside again and I will forget all about the data analysis. So just a little bit about my background. I did a Bachelor of Science honors in environmental science, and it was coupled with a co-op, which was a four-month internship for each of my summer breaks. And then that led me to specialize into a Master of Science in Applied Science. And basically for my research, I am looking at quantifying the ecosystem services of these marshes. So the marshes that are natural and healthy, comparing those to marshes that are not so healthy, and how much of a difference there is between those two marshes. So that's what my work is about. And then when it comes to previous roles, I worked as a CLEAD intern. I was employed by Back to the Sea Society. I would communicate and as volunteers for that society, but I would mostly communicate with the different audiences on intertidal species. So I learned about intertidal species and their value. So would have like crabs or sea stars or whatever creatures, and kids would come in, they would learn more about the ocean and understand the value that it has, why we need to keep the ocean clean, and what are some steps can take towards a sustainable future for our oceans. And then most of my roles were really through technician positions where it was related to coastal stuff. So the coastal wetland technician position, and then the climate vulnerability technician position, hydrodynamics technician. And then I also worked as an entomology research technician, which was not really related to what I wanted to do, but it was a good way for me to get a head start in terms of finding these other positions. So when I was applying for the other jobs, the experience I had from my past actually served for my good. So in terms of tips that I would like to leave with you, I would say always keep an open mind. I remember the first time when I heard about salt marshes and just the kind of work you'd be doing, I literally looked at one of my classmates because it was an external presentation and we had a guest speaker, and who's now my boss, which is very interesting. But back in the day, I was like, ew, who wants to work with mud? And I was like, nope, that's not going to be me. I am too cute for that. I will not be doing that. And surprisingly, like 3 years later, like this is actually literally my exact line of work. And I collect sediment samples and I do work with mud, and it is not the worst thing ever. It's actually turned out to be the best. So it's good to have an open mind when you're looking or you're still trying to figure out what your area of interest is, or if you already know it, it's good to keep an open mind. Look out for opportunities that may be good for you or that you think you might be interested in, and you never know what those would lead to. And you should always have a willingness to learn. I've heard that you should never think that you're the smartest person in the room, and this is true, because if you are, then it means that you're not learning, you're not challenging yourself. So any opportunity you can get, you should learn, you should advance your knowledge, you should develop. And lastly, I would say never compromise your core values. And this is really big. Like I think sometimes when we're in a work environment, we feel like the life of the company is literally in our hands. But the moment you say, you know what, goodbye, I'm done with this job, it's been a great journey, tomorrow they are doing interviews and they're finding someone else to replace you. So don't think you're indispensable. But that's to say, like, if you think that a position that you have is not in line with your core values. For example, I really prefer to have time off than more money. So if I were to get a job and they're like, you have to work on weekends and on holidays, then I will be like, oh, I'm sorry, this was really a great opportunity, but I can't work on weekends. And also just if, for example, there's no diversity, or if they're not embracing diversity or differences in leadership styles, and maybe that's something that's a core value to you, that is something you should probably take a step back and think about. Is this a place or an environment that you want to grow in or not? And then lastly, I would leave you with a mantra that I really have been following lately: to keep doing the things that make you feel alive. So every time I step outside, I really do feel alive. Maybe I don't feel that way when I analyze data, but when I go outside, I feel alive, and I feel like I have my raison d'etre, and I feel like, oh, this is very exciting. Like, I know that the data that I'm collecting, or I know that the work that I'm doing is for the greater good, and that gives me life. It gives me a reason to keep living and doing what I do. So once you keep doing those things, then it will cease to feel like it's a chore or this thing that you have to get up to. Like, every morning you're like, oh my goodness, I have to log on to work. If you're going to constantly have that feeling, then maybe it's time for a career change, or maybe it's time to take a vacation and time off and then come back when you feel rejuvenated and ready to work. So I am now ready to take questions. Thank you for listening, and thank you for coming and joining us today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Maka. Thanks for your presentation. And actually, I have one question for you. I love how you're passionate about your role, and have
Thank
you
you.
always wanted to work in this field? And like, for example, when you were 10, was it this career path that you wanted, or how did you join this sector?
Okay, thank you for that question. So first of all, I knew that I wanted to do something related to the environment, right? That has always been a thing for me. And I remember just like in high school, I always wanted to go for these trips because we would always end up maybe like going outside or doing outdoor stuff, hiking, camping. That was fun for me. So I already had this passion for the outdoors. And so when I came to university, I decided I want to do environmental science. But what really sparked my interest was mostly my desire to problem solve, but also use my love for the environment. So I wanted to merge my love or passion for the environment with my ability for problem solving. So that's how it led me to this career path. And then my desire to continue to build my experience so I can be an environmental consultant in some years.
Thank you so much. What are some challenges to your job? You mentioned that you go on site on the field a lot. Are there any
Mhm.
challenges?
I think one of some of the challenges that we face out there are that when you work a job like mine, it's a very unpredictable day. So when I work in the office, I know I'm going to log on and I'm going to have a meeting, and then afterwards I'll log off. But when you go out on the field, you don't know what you'll encounter. And I think sometimes we have really long deployments. Last year, I was working in New Brunswick, and it's a 5-hour drive from here. So like obviously you're tired after driving, and then you'll settle down, and then tomorrow you get up early, you get on the field. So it is rigorous work. So sometimes you also have to navigate harsh terrain, and you also have to work when it's cold, and like sometimes you work when it's too hot. But then there's also like a line between your health and safety as well in this kind of position, because it's also at your own discretion. So you need to have that willpower to be like, okay, I can only do this much, but then there's a heat warning, so I'm not going to work. So the deployments that are further will take us like a weekend. You're out there, you're away from family. So if you have a family, or if you have arrangements with friends, that can sometimes be an inconvenience. But the good thing is that you're out there, and then you come back after a week, and then you can continue to live your life.
Yes. What is one thing that you would want someone outside of your field, of your sector, someone outside environmental consulting to know about your job?
I think one thing I would have to say is that things are more connected than they actually may appear. So, me collecting data for my work and maybe understanding how that wave data is along the coastline has more of an impact, because once you know, you're probably not going to build along that coastline. Maybe you go tell your relative that, you know what, like we've seen some figures and this is not a good idea. And also just to say, I think everybody has their role to play. Although people have different career paths, one way or the other, it also always comes back to the environment. So if you're in policy, we need people who are policymakers to create policies that are environmentally related. If you're in engineering, the same applies to those designs. And if you're in finance and economics, we need models that incorporate the value of nature. And like, even though sometimes we have contentions on what the true value of nature is, we still need people in all fields to come together so that we can create a sustainable future.
Exactly. And I also see how so many people, especially students, are now following this path and want to
Mhm.
work in the environmental sector. And for you, how do you foresee yourself evolving within this sector?
So within the sector, I think one of the things that has been a primary goal for me has really just to get my education done so that I'm equipped as well with the skills. So not just, oh, I went to school, I got my master's, but also that I went to school and I also have work experience in my field, so I can reconcile the academic side of things with actually what's happening on the ground. Because usually when people are just like, oh, I have a master's or I have a PhD, there's sometimes a disconnect between that and what's actually happening in the real world. And in terms of furthering my experience in the next few years, I'm really like looking towards gaining experience in my field with like actual other projects that are slightly different from just the Atlantic coast. And maybe that would look like working with a project partner in the UK and seeing how they adapt to those changes, or working with somebody else in another cold region to see how they adapt. And with time, having received or acquired that expertise, I can contribute to different boards of directors or different companies that may need my expertise.
Thank you. And I know you mentioned about some helpful tips, but do you have any advice for people who aspire to become a junior environmental consultant?
Yes, the last few things I would have to say is like things are always changing. So you need to also be up to date with certifications and also be up to date with the new regulations. So there'll be new laws and policies that will come into place, which will affect how you handle your clientele basis. But when it comes to consulting, you pretty much can chart your own path. It can be a specific niche. You could focus maybe on coastal protection, but you could also be focused on other things that are related to the environment that are not necessarily coasts.
Yes, thank you. And I guess my last question is, where can people find you and learn from you on social media, LinkedIn, or email?
Yes. So for my contact, I will share the contacts with you, and maybe like the few participants that are here can get my email address, but I am available on LinkedIn, and it's my first name, Maka, and last name, Ngulube. So there are some posts that I do from time to time about where I'm working, or if I'm attending conferences, I'll share that. There's quite a bit of information. I have done a few things. So if you just go on YouTube and type my name, you should be able to find a few things pop up that could help you. And most of it is just material understanding what my research is about and what my work is about.
Thank you so much. I don't see any questions in the chat, so I'm going to wrap things up. Thank you so much, Maka, for taking the time to share your story. For everyone who joined us today, your time and attention is greatly appreciated. And if you have any questions, feel free to connect with either of us after the call. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Chloe.